Yeah.
Stand live. I'll give you a thumbs up when we're ready.
Okay. Hello, everybody. I hope you can all hear me clearly. My name is Daisy Knox, and I'll be moderating today's session. Now, while people are still joining, I just wanted to note a couple of points. First of all, a reminder that this webinar will focus on the movement of people towards the UK. Colleagues present today may not be able to answer questions about UK nationals travelling to EU member states. Second, that we will share the slides and additional resources with all of those registered after the event. This means that if you joined via LinkedIn and you wish to receive these resources, please could you also register now using the link that is in the chat bar. Third of all, please do post your questions in the chat throughout, and we'll address these as best we can in the Q&A sessions. So without further ado, I turn to today's first speaker, Her Majesty's Trade Commissioner for Europe, Richard Byrne. Over to you, Richard.
Daisy, thank you very much. Welcome to the call, everybody, and thank you for taking the time to join us today. As you know, the UK has left the EU, and on the 31st of December 2020, the transition period will end, and the UK will leave the EU single market and the customs union. So from the 1st of January 2021, the rules for trading with the UK will change. If you run an EU-based business, you need to check the new rules and prepare for the changes so that you can continue trading successfully with the UK from January next year. These actions are required regardless of the outcome of current negotiations with the EU. As the Department of International Trade's Commissioner for Europe, my team across the region supports their preparations. The UK government recognises the great importance of keeping business moving between the UK and the EU. Services, and so people, are at the heart of this trade. But from the 1st of January, freedom of movement between the EU and the UK, as we have known it, will end. We have agreed with the EU that we will protect the rights of EU citizens and their family members who are living in the UK at the end of the transition period. And we recognise how important it is for businesses to continue to export and provide services in person and move expertise to where it is needed. Under the UK's new immigration system, Britain will continue to be open for business, but this system will bring direct changes to how your business trades in services with the UK, how you undertake business activity in the UK, and how your UK branches employ EU citizens. Many of you on the call today have UK subsidiaries and need to understand changes to employing European staff in the UK. Others travel frequently to the UK for business and pleasure and will want to understand how these movements will change from the 1st of January. Today, I welcome our colleagues from the Home Office and the Department of Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy, who will take you through the changes both to long-term immigration and short-term business travel to the UK after the end of the transition period. They will do their best to answer your most pressing questions on the movement of people and how these changes will impact the way you do business with the UK. I've been very happy to see that so many UK and EU businesses have engaged with other virtual readiness events that our team at DIT has organised. These events have allowed businesses from markets across the continent directly to engage with the UK government on how best to prepare for upcoming changes. I hope today's webinar will do the same. So I'm delighted to welcome you all. I'll now hand back to Daisy. Thank you.
Thank you, Richard. Just very briefly before we move to today's presentation, I wanted to ask you to participate in a quick readiness poll. Now you can do this by going to slide.do and using the code MOP, or you can scan the QR code on the screen. You can follow the link that will be posted in the chat. This should only take a few seconds. The poll is entirely anonymous. We can only see the percentages at the end of it, but it will help us to assess your awareness of the topics we discussed today, both before and after the event. So if you don't mind just taking a few instants to fill that in. Again, you can either just go to slide.do, You can scan the QR code or you can use the link in the chat. That would be really helpful. Thank you. And I'll just give you a few instances to do that, and then we'll hand over to our presenters. It should really only take a few seconds. Okie dokie. So our first presentation today will be delivered by Dan Petriello from the Home Office. So over to you, Dan.
Thank you very much, Daisy. Thank you for the invitation to speak here today. My name is Dan and I work on the Home Office's external engagement team, covering the new points-based immigration system and the EU settlement scheme. I'm joined today by my policy colleague, Richard Jackson, and together we're going to give you some key information about the new immigration system and the EU settlement scheme. Like everybody, we've made this shift to online engagement this year, which has largely been very successful, but things can go wrong. So I apologise now if the dog barks or the doorbell rings, and if the slides get stuck or anything like that, please make us aware via the chat function. Can we go onto the next slide, please? So firstly, I'm just going to go through the EU settlement scheme, give you some key information on that, and then we'll take some questions, and then we will go through the highlights of the new immigration system and again take questions on that subject. So can we go on to the next slide? So I suppose the key headlines of the EU settlement scheme is essentially that EU, EEA and Swiss citizens and their family members still have plenty of time to apply to the EU settlement scheme. So those living in the UK by the 31st of December are eligible to apply, and they have until the 30th of June 2021 to make an application. During that period, employers, landlords, public service providers will continue to accept passports and national ID cards from EU citizens as evidence of permission, as they do now. So our latest statistics indicate that we've received over 4.2 million applications to the scheme, and there are still thousands of applications being received every day. Can we go on to the next slide, please? So what is the EU settlement scheme? Well, it's open, as I mentioned, to EU, EEA and Swiss citizens and their family members. The scheme gives them a status under UK law and protects their rights so that they can continue to be eligible for public services, public funds and pensions as they are now. In the future, they can apply for British citizenship if that's something that they want to do. And I think it's really clear that the Home Office has been proactive in terms of we are looking for reasons to grant people a status. We are not trying to make this an arduous process. Who needs to apply? Well, in short, everyone, those who are here before the 31st of December of this year who wish to live and work in the UK after that date. Those with permanent residence issued under the EA regulations need to apply so they can get that status under UK law. Those who previously received indefinite leave to remain can apply if they wish to do so. Irish nationals don't need to do so, but they can do if they wish. How do you make an application? Well, it's a free online application. There are 3 steps and eligible citizens receive either settled or pre-settled status. So I've mentioned that there are 3 steps, and the first one is proof of identity. So we need to know that the person applying is an EU national or the family member of an EU national, and they can do that in person, COVID restrictions permitting. They can do it by post, or they can use our app, which essentially lets you read the biometric chip in your document and take a selfie that way. And if you can use that, you don't need to part with your identity document. We also ask for proof of residence, so it's not proof of activity, it's proof of residence. The easiest way to do that is if the applicant provides us with their national insurance number. We will carry out automated checks of records held by HMRC and DWP. If this can evidence the person's UK residence, then they won't need to supply any further information. Around 75% of applicants don't need to provide any further information. Obviously, that doesn't work for every scenario, and applicants can provide additional information on there. And then there is also a criminality check that is done on every application. I've mentioned that there are two statuses an applicant may receive, so they are settled and pre-settled status. And eligible citizens receive those statuses based upon the information that they have provided us. But whether someone has pre-settled or settled status, they've been accepted through the scheme and have secured their rights to remain in the UK. Pre-settled status is for those who've been in the UK for less than 5 years. All those who receive pre-settled status get 5 years leave to remain in the UK, and then they can apply for settled status in the future if they want to, after they've completed 5 years continuous residence in the UK. Settled status is for those who've been in the UK for over 5 years, and that person can demonstrate they've been in the UK for 6 months within every 12-month period. We also allow one absence of up to 12 months for a specific reason, such as work, study, caring for a relative. There's quite a long list there. And a person with settled status can stay in the UK for as long as they wish. They receive indefinite leave to remain, and they can leave the UK for up to 5 years without losing that status. We go on to the next slide, please. So we put in a large amount of support for people to make applications to the scheme. So we have a designated contact centre that's open 7 days a week. It's one where the call handlers are casework trained. They can talk people through the application process. And they can really sort of take their time with applicants on there. We've also given £17 million to 72 organisations across the UK to help those who need more support in making applications. We have a assisted digital service to help those who are less familiar with technology to help them make applications. And we've also provided employers with toolkits. We provided community toolkits. We have provided videos on the application process, and we have materials available in 26 different languages. And you can find all this information on gov.uk, but they will be covered in the suite of materials that we will send out after this call. Appreciate that's a quick canter through the EU settlement scheme, but happy to take any questions on the settlement scheme now before we talk about the new system.
Thank you, Dan. I have a couple of pre-submitted questions here. So the first one is regarding EU students. So EU students that have started their first academic year in the UK this year, so in September or October, and who due to the pandemic have not yet moved to the UK, and whose classes are of course online. So there's concern that they'll lose their settlement rights if they're not in the UK before December. Could you perhaps clarify this issue and tell us if there's any way around this?
Yeah, I mean, so the short answer is that to be eligible for pre-settled status, individuals are going to have to have been in the UK for a period in the last 6 months. Now that period can be it doesn't have to be a significant time period. So if an individual arrived in the UK on the 26th of December and could evidence that they were in the UK on that date by having a train ticket or a hotel booking or some evidence that they'd arrived in the UK, that individual would have enough evidence to be able to submit an application and receive pre-settled status. But there is going to have been a period where that individual is physically present in the UK. I do know that this issue has been raised before. It's something that the Department of Education have raised as well. So I don't know whether there'll be any further sort of developments with that, but at present that is the situation, that the person would need to have been physically present in the UK at some point.
Thank you, that's very clear. There's another pre-submitted question here that I think also relates to a question I can see in the chat which is to do with the position of employees and right to work checks between the 1st of January and the end of June when the application to the scheme closes.
Okay, yeah, so the important thing to note is we are conscious that those individuals that are protected by the withdrawal agreement have until the end of June of next year to make an application to the settlement scheme. So employers can't ask an individual for evidence of their status under the settlement scheme during that period, because they do have until the end of June to make an application. So what we want to make really clear is we won't be asking employers to try and differentiate between someone who has arrived in the UK, say in December of this year. We won't ask the employer to tell them apart with someone else who has arrived in, say, February of next year. What we will do is we will continue to allow employers to do the same right to work checks that they do now. So they just need to check a European passport or identity card, and that will be what a right to work check will consist of, as is the situation now, until the end of June. We will be issuing full new right to work guidance early next year, which will cover the situation from July onwards.
Brilliant, thank you. I can't see any more questions in the chat about the EU settlement scheme, so perhaps let's continue with the second half of your presentation.
Okay. If we can just switch on to the next slide. And again. Okay, so actually, you know, this changes so quickly at the moment, so I'll run through everything. So we published our initial policy statement, what feels like a lifetime ago, in February, which kind of set out some broad parameters for the new system. Then in July, we published an additional document which kind of gave draft requirements for the key routes. Since then, an awful lot has happened. So our Home Secretary has laid changes to the immigration rules that underpin the new system. That was done in October. Those rules also introduced our new routes for Hong Kong nationals. But clearly, as the end of the transition period is upon us, it's important that businesses, citizens and education establishments understand what steps they need to take. A broader comms campaign to support the new immigration system began a few months ago. This obviously complements the government's Get Ready campaign, and we are delivering an ongoing series of engagement events. Even with the challenges of COVID, we've ran about 200 online engagement events since the start of the first lockdown. Comms materials are now available throughout the EU. We've started doing our own marketing within the member states to raise awareness of the new immigration system within the UK. On the 1st of December, the routes actually opened for applications for those who wish to come to the UK from the 1st of January onwards. So those routes are now all open, they are live, the guidance and rules are all available there on gov.uk. And again, we will send out all the appropriate links after this session. We go on to the next slide. Thank you. So it's probably just worth me recapping the main features of the policy and its core principles. So the government's goal is to deliver a new, fairer, firmer, skills-led system from the 1st of January 2021. At the end of free movement on the 31st of December, we know that the EU settlement scheme will cater for those EU nationals and their family members already in the UK, but new arrivals to the UK from that point onwards will now be catered for under the new immigration system. And this will be a global immigration system where everyone will be treated equally. There'll be a points-based system which aims to attract the best and brightest based on the skills that someone will bring to the UK. As a key part of our reforms, we're looking to simplify and streamline our rules, our systems and our processes. And I'll now start to work through some of the different routes with you, and I'll start with the skilled worker route. Can we go on to the next slide, please? And again. Okay, so we are making the necessary changes so that it's simpler for employers in the UK to attract the best and brightest from around the world to come to the UK and complement the skills that we already have. As we set out from the start, anyone coming to the UK from 1st of January next year, including EU citizens, if they are arriving for the first time, will need to demonstrate they meet a specific set of requirements for which they will score points. A particular feature of this route is that it gives employers flexibility by allowing applicants to trade points if they have relevant qualifications or work in a job that's on the shortage occupation list in the UK. It's more flexible than our existing Tier 2 route, which we use for non-EU migration at the moment. The core requirements of the new route are that the applicant must have an offer from a job offer from an approved sponsor. The applicant must speak English to an acceptable standard. There will be a criminality threshold. The job must be at the minimum skill level, so that's RQF level 3 or equivalent, so A level or equivalent qualification in the UK. That's not to say that workers need to hold that formal qualification. It's the skill level of the job that they will be doing, which is important. And migrants must meet the required salary for that job. This will either be the general salary threshold, which on the advice of the Independent Migration Advisory Committee, we are lowering to 25,600, or it will be the going rate for the job if that's higher. So we have suspended the cap on these routes. There will be no resident labour market test, which we have removed. I've mentioned that the skills threshold there is expanded and the salary threshold is lowered, and I'll talk through what these tradable points mean over the next couple of slides and show you what they mean in practice. Could we go on to the next slide, please? So we talk a lot about points, but what does this actually mean? So for the skilled worker route, an applicant will need to score a total of 70 points. By meeting the mandatory criteria, so they've got that job offer from an approved sponsor, it's at the right skill level, and they meet the English language requirement, they will score 50 points. To qualify for the skilled worker visa, they must obtain a further 20 tradable points through a combination of points for their salary, a job on the UK's shortage occupation list, or a relevant PhD. I've mentioned that there is a required salary for each role, and this is the higher of that general salary threshold, £25,600, or the going rate for that job. In our document that we published in July, that contained an annex which gives a breakdown of the different professions and the going rates. So for instance, a civil engineer is required to earn £35,000 because that is the going rate for the salary in the UK. However, it is possible to reduce the salary requirements if the migrant can score points for their attributes or the nature of their job. If a job's on the shortage occupation list, the migrant can get a 20% discount. If the migrant has a PhD that's relevant to their job, that's worth 10%, rising to 20% if the PhD is in a STEM subject. New entrants to the labour market can also secure a 30% discount on those salary requirements. Those discounts apply to whatever sum the migrant would otherwise need to earn, so that general salary threshold or the going rate. But there is a general floor of £20,480 below which a salary cannot drop when discounts have been applied. The number of public sector occupations which are subject to separate arrangements based on published pay scales, that's things like teaching. And we will retain the ability to increase the number of attributes for which individuals can score tradable points in the future to help us meet the needs of the economy. But the mandatory requirements won't become tradable. Now we'll send out the toolkits after this session, and in the employer's guide, there are a lot of different scenarios in which you can trade points and, different attributes, different situations that might be relevant to your particular sector or area. But I'll just run through a couple of different ones now. So could we go on to the next slide, please? So in this scenario, the individual's been offered a job as a mechanical engineer. So they meet all the mandatory criteria. So they've got a job from an approved sponsor, it's at the right skill level, and they meet the English language requirement. That gives them 50 points. So they need to get them extra 20 points to give them the 70-point total. So in this scenario, the individual has been offered a salary of £26,750. This is below the going rate for a mechanical engineer, which is £33,400. So the individual does not score any points for their salary. However, as this is a job which is on the shortage occupation list, he receives 20 points for the job being on that list, and that's how he reaches the 70-point total. Can we go on to the next slide, please? Okay, in this scenario, the individual has been offered a job as a general manager. So general managers, the salary threshold there is the general salary threshold of £25,600. This individual has got a job from an approved sponsor. It's at the right skill level, and they meet the English language requirement. So that gets them 50 points. Because the salary they've been offered is £26,300, which is above that general salary threshold, the individual scores 20 points for their salary, and that's how they reach the 70-point total in this scenario. Can we go on to the next slide, please? Okay, so we've engaged extensively and listened carefully to business and are making a number of changes in the way that they can sponsor a migrant to come to the UK. We're removing the resident labour market test, suspending the cap on numbers, and under the previous process, we issued certificates of sponsorship on a monthly panel, and that has been abolished. So cumulatively, this should mean a reduction in the process of up to 8 weeks. Crucially, businesses are trying to decide now whether they need to become a sponsor. A key point to note is that you don't need to become a sponsor to employ someone from the UK resident labour market. So that includes those over 4 million EU nationals who've already applied to stay under the EU settlement scheme. We will also allow migrants to switch into a different route without having to leave the UK, though they will need to meet the requirements of the route that they are switching to. We are making whole-scale changes to our sponsorship system in 2022, which we are currently in the process of working through with users. Can we go on to the next slide, please? So I've mentioned becoming a sponsor, but what does that actually mean? So the first thing to do is to check that any planned vacancies are eligible under one of our licenses, and we'll send the link out so that you can do so. To become a sponsor, in most cases, a company needs to provide at least 4 documents, and these will depend on the nature and size of your business, but might include things like financial records, a staff organogram of your management structure, things like that. To get a license, you can't have any unspent criminal convictions for immigration offences or certain other crimes. This is all explained in the guidance. And when you apply, you need to appoint a person or persons within your business to manage that sponsorship process and access our sponsor management system. You apply online and pay the appropriate fee, which again depends on the size of your business and the roles that you're planning to fill. And we'll ask you to confirm how many staff you plan to recruit over the current financial year. Once you've selected a candidate, they must make a visa application to come and work in the UK, and you endorse this prospective employee's visa application via your sponsor license account, and they get issued with an electronic certificate of sponsorship. You may have to pay the immigration skills charge if it's required on the role that you're filling, and then the employee submits their visa application under the same category as your license. If that visa application is successful, they can then come to the UK and start working. As I previously mentioned, we're currently redesigning this entire process and we're actively consulting with stakeholders at the moment. Could we go on to the next slide, please? And again, so I'm going to run through some of the other routes. So yeah, next slide again, please. So from January 2021, we are extending our global talent route to EU nationals. Under this route, the most highly skilled workers who can achieve the required level of points are able to enter the UK without a job offer if they are endorsed by a Home Office recognised endorsing body. This route is designed to attract recognised global leaders and best and brightest in science, humanities, engineering, the arts and digital technology. Some of the key changes to this route, aside from allowing EU nationals to enter under this route, are that we are expanding the consideration for senior appointments so that the route can cater for people at earlier stages in their career, not necessarily those who are more advanced. The definition of the types of academic and research roles that qualify is also being expanded, and a points assessment is being introduced in line with the overall points-based system. In the longer term, we are also exploring the creation of a new, broader, unsponsored route, which will allow a small number of most highly skilled individuals to come to the UK without a job offer, and we're engaging with stakeholders on what this policy will look like at the moment. Could we go on to the next slide, please? Okay, so the UK's new points-based immigration system does not seek to replicate free movement in any way, and will not include a route for those who do not meet the skills and salary thresholds, or a route for temporary work. We know that UK employers need to concentrate on investment in technology, automation and the training up of the UK's domestic labour force, particularly given the impacts of COVID-19, and we know that employers will need to adjust. This new immigration system provides UK employers with greater flexibility in terms of those changes to salary and skills thresholds. And as I mentioned, there are over 4 million applications to the EU settlement scheme already who will not need to be sponsored to work in the UK. We anticipate that the seasonal workers pilot will also provide employers with further flexibility. We go on to the next slide, please. Apologies for the doorbell as well. So, as outlined in our February policy statement, students will also come under the new points-based system, and there'll be no limits on numbers. The student route actually went live on the 5th of October, so that was our first route that opened, and that is open and receiving applications. In fact, it's the government's ambition to increase the number of international students to 600,000 by 2030. Our student route is based on our existing Tier 4 route for non-EU migrants, which is working well. And we'll also be introducing a new graduate route from summer 2021 to allow those who've completed a degree in the UK to stay for 2 years afterwards and work at any skill level, and then switch into the skilled work route if they find a suitable job. They can stay for 3 years if they've graduated with a PhD, and that's on the proviso that's from a higher education provider with a good track record of compliance. We're also extending the period of time in which a student can apply for permission to come to the UK before the start of their course from 3 months to 6 months. We go on to the next slide, please. Okay, so anyone can apply to visit the UK. They must either apply for a visa before arrival or seek leave to enter at the border. Visa nationals apply anywhere outside of the UK, and non-visa nationals can apply at the border. In most cases, visitors can come to the UK for up to 6 months. A visitor may enter the UK multiple times, but they may not live in the UK by means of repeat visits. And we will permit study of up to 6 months under the standard visit route. The UK government has already said that it's not its intention for citizens of the EU and Switzerland to require visas to visit the UK. You go on to the next slide, please. Okay, for a number of the main economic routes, the main change for January is actually bringing EU citizens into the current non-EU routes. There's a long list, so I won't go through them all, but you can see it includes routes such as our startup and innovator route, our charity route. In addition to that, EU nationals are also eligible to apply under our health and care visa, which allows those with a job offer from NHS, social care, or employers who provide services to the NHS to come to the UK. In the longer term, we're committed to simplifying the rules and guidance of our immigration system. We want to make best use of technology and best practice from the EU settlement scheme in terms of we've managed to make a really straightforward process and deal with a really large number of applications in a short period of time. So anything that we can learn from that and translate across our immigration system as a whole, we're going to do so. Just conscious of time, can we skip through the next 2 slides, please? Well, I'm happy to share the slide pack, but if we can go straight to the one that says next steps, yeah. So the slides actually can't even get updated quick enough because this actually changed yesterday. So the immigration bill has completed its passage through Parliament. That's obviously the legal basis for ending free movement at the end of the year. And our new immigration routes all opened yesterday. So they opened yesterday for those who wish to come to the UK from the 1st of January onwards. Obviously, the key thing that we always continually highlight is EU citizens and their family members resident before the end of the transition period continue to be eligible for the settlement scheme, and the deadline for applications is the end of June of next year. Can we go on to the next slide, please? So we have made an awful lot of information available on the new system. So we have guides aimed at employers, aimed at EU citizens, aimed at students. We have guides for employers on bringing individuals into the UK. We have guides on how to become a sponsor. We have videos and fact sheets. Can we go on to the next slide, please? And we have toolkits for our skilled worker route, our graduate route, our global talent route, and we now have pages translated into 25 EU languages. We'll send all those links out as well. And we also have a Home Office podcast if anyone wants to listen to. It's basically a kind of conversational style breakdown of the new system that we did in collaboration with the Federation of Small Businesses in the UK. So yeah, that is available to download now. Appreciate that was an awful lot of information in one go. I'm now going to bring in my colleague Richard Jackson, and we're going to try and work through the questions that you've submitted. So I'm going to stop talking and just have a quick drink.
Thank you, Dan. Thank you, Richard. We have quite a lot of questions. Just for the sake of the audience, I wanted to make clear that I'm not avoiding questions on short-term travel to the UK, but these will be better addressed in the next Q&A after the next presentation. So the first question I have here is regarding students. Where can one find out what language certificates are accepted under the student route?
Can we unmute Richard? Is that possible?
Perhaps not.
Richard, sorry, could you do maybe #6 on your phone so that unmutes you?
In the meanwhile, are you happy to take some questions, Dan?
Yeah. So I think
I think I might be unmuted.
Yeah, he is. He's here.
Oh, fantastic.
Yeah.
Hi, Richard. So I'm not sure if you heard that. The first question was, where can we find what language certificates are accepted under the student route?
Yeah, and it's not a question. The first question off the bat is one that I don't know the answer to. I mean, there is lots of guidance on the student route on gov.uk, but it's not a route that I have any involvement in.
No worries.
We'll send out the toolkit that goes along with the student route, and it does have in there the different requirements in there. Yeah.
Thank you. And the second question is, how is the going rate for salaries determined?
Okay, so all of our going rates are published in all the guidance that's on gov.uk, so employers can find out easily enough what the going rate is for their occupation code. In terms of how they're actually worked out, they're based on the advice of the Independent Migration Advisory Committee. And what the MAC did was look at national salary data. There's a survey called the Annual Survey of Hours and Earnings, which looks at thousands of UK employees in various occupations and collects salary data based on that. So what we've picked as the going rate is the 25th percentile of that data for each occupation. So it's relatively low level. It's less than the UK average salary for each occupation. And the reason for that is to allow for the fact that salaries are higher in some parts of the UK than others, to allow a bit of a regional variation without going down the road of having to sort of have regional salary requirements. There's a few exceptions for some jobs, mostly in the public sector, in sectors like teaching and education, where we use nationally agreed pay scales for those instead. But that's how they worked out. They're all based on UK earnings data.
Thank you. I wanted to ask, and do tell me if this is better saved for the next presentation, but do you have any information on the frontier worker status?
I don't. Again, that's a policy that my colleagues deal with. It's not one that I'm involved in directly.
Not to worry. Thank you. We'll circulate information about that after this event. And finally, could you tell us what happens if a UK national who's a resident and self-employed in an EU country who would travel to the UK to work for clients in the UK, does that mean that they would then have to pay tax and social security in the UK? Do you know?
That's a question for HMRC rather than the Home Office, I think.
Okay, we will save that one for them. And I'll take one more before we move on. Is there a priority service for sponsorship, and how does this work?
So we do have, go on.
Go on, Dan.
Sorry, I was going to say we do have a premium sponsorship service, so you can apply to become a premium sponsor, and you can get then an account manager, which is essentially a designated Home Office contact to assist you through that process. We can include the details of what that entails and what that looks like in the suite of information we send out after this meeting, if it would be useful.
That would be brilliant. Thank you. Just one more. Is there a form to prove that you have a job offer? Is there a specific way that this needs to be proven?
So if you're applying and you're under the new system, your prospective employer will have issued you with an electronic certificate of sponsorship, and that is the job offer effectively. Richard, that's right, isn't it?
That's right, yeah. And it's all handled online, as Dan says. So that certificate of sponsorship just has a reference number with it, and you just need to quote that reference number when you apply for your work visa, and then the Home Office will be able to check the details of your sponsor and the job you've been offered using that reference number.
It's very clear. Thank you. Now, looking at the time, I think we best move on to the next presentation. I think a lot of the remaining questions will be best answered in the next Q&A in any case. So thank you very much, Dan and Richard.
Yeah, and if you want to just send us anything that comes up that you think is for us, and we'll reply and write in, that's fine.
Absolutely, that would be brilliant. Thank you. And
okay.
If we could now turn to Katrina Riley from the Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy.
Hi everyone. I hope you're having a lovely afternoon. Thank you so much for having me join the session today. Could we go to the next slide, please? Brilliant. So I work in the Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy on EU negotiations. Specifically, I work on Mobility Mode 4, which is also known as entry and temporary stay. We have quite a few names. Essentially, what I work on is the movement of people across a border for work purposes. Kind of two things that I really want to just mention before we dive in about Mode 4 is one is that Mode 4 as a policy area interacts with a broad range of economic sectors. So, for example, movement under Mode 4 could be as an accountant going to a meeting in another country, as a lawyer going to consult on a contract. It could be as an actor who's Portuguese moving to the UK to be in a play, or a professional sportsman going to take part in a tournament. It's really got a wide breadth of interaction across services economy. The second thing that I really want to highlight before we jump in is that Mode 4 as a policy area and what I'm going to talk about today is inherently temporary, as the name kind of suggests. This means that when you're moving, you're always intending to return to your home nation states. And this has, again, quite a long length of stay. So it could be, you're moving for 2 days or you're moving for 2 years. But as long as you have that sort of intention to return, you're generally classified under Mode 4. Can I move to the next slide, please? So when we talk about Mode 4, we talk really specifically through various categories of movement or forms of cross-border mobility. I'm just going to briefly chat through them just to kind of give you a bit of context. So the first kind of form of movement is a short-term business visitor. So this is generally like quick trips, generally on short notice, to maybe be in a meeting or to attend a conference. Length of stay for a short-term business visitor, if you're travelling to the EU, is generally 90 days and 180-day period if you're UK national. Travelling to the UK, it's slightly different. The UK offers a length of stay for short-term business visitors at 6 months, so a bit longer. The second route is as an intra-corporate transferee. What this means is essentially you work in the branch of a company, branch or subsidiary, in one country, and you go to another branch in a different country. So, for example, I work for Vodafone in Germany, and I'm going to go to the Vodafone branch in the UK for a year, 2 years to work on a project. Third, we have contractual service suppliers. So what this means is that you're employed with one organisation and you're going to do work for another. So an example I like to use is I'm an engineer in a UK-based company. BMW needs my services for like 6 months to work on a part. So I go over to Germany to do that, and then I come back. But I don't work for BMW. And this also applies in the fourth route as a self-employed person. So, I'm my own boss and I've been hired by another company in a different country to supply a service. And then finally, the fifth route is as an investor, which is quite straightforward. People who move temporarily to invest on behalf of a company. So generally going abroad to set up a branch for a few months. Next slide, please. So this is the slide that I really want to spend the most time talking to you about today, which is on business travel to the UK. So what do you need to do? Well, as we know, freedom of movement is ending, but that doesn't mean you can't still move to the UK to supply services. What's really important to note before we kind of jump into the more specifics is that business travellers from the EU, from EEA nations, so from Norway, Liechtenstein or Iceland, and also from Switzerland, may now need to apply for a visa before travelling to the UK from the 1st of January 2021. And it's also important to note that this will be in both a deal and a non-negotiated outcome. So in any event, whatever happens, you may need to think about a visa from next year. So while any provisions under a UK-EU FTA agreement are still subject to kind of ongoing talks, EU nationals under the UK's domestic immigration system will be able to travel to the UK, as I mentioned, for short stays of up to 6 months without a visa when undertaking specifically defined activities. So on gov.uk, we have a list of permitted activities, and we've got a link here on the slide, and hopefully this will get circulated to you after the event. I really recommend spending some time looking through that list. The UK offers quite an expanded list of permitted activities in comparison to other EU member states, and it includes things like business meetings and attending conferences, but also some after sales activities. So, you may be sold a part to a UK company, you're based in the EU, under certain rules you may be able to go in and service that part. And we also have a broad range of cultural, legal and entertainment related activities. So yeah, spending some time having a look through that list is definitely recommended. Now, if you are traveling for longer than 6 months, or you are going to undertake an activity that isn't included on this list, it's likely you're going to need a visa. So EU, EEA and Swiss nationals can apply through the UK's points-based immigration system, and there's a number of routes that are available for temporary movement. A couple other things I just want to quickly pick up on is that from the 1st of October 2021, EU, EEA and Swiss national ID cards will no longer be accepted by the UK as valid travel documents. There are a few exceptions, so if you have settled or pre-settled status under the EU settlement scheme, for example, but generally there's going to be a transition. Also, EU EFTA nationals can continue to use automatic e-gates at UK border entry points at some airports if there is a biometric symbol on the cover of their passport and if they're over 12. And the final thing, just before we move on, is to also mention that the UK is very aware that preparing for this transition and a transition period is really important to businesses, and that is why we have opened now visa applications early. So from yesterday, from the 1st of December, EU nationals can apply along with EEA and Swiss nationals for visas under the temporary movement scheme, so that in January it was easier to move and there's slightly more certainty. Next slide, please. Now, I know that this is not the purpose of this webinar exactly, but I just wanted to touch on travel to the EU, EEA and Switzerland, as I think it's really important to have both sides of the story, and just to keep everyone aware in case you are hiring a UK national to come over. So as I said, things are going to be slightly different. UK nationals might need a visa, work permit or other documentation. So as I mentioned previously, UK nationals would be able to travel without needing a visa to the Schengen area for short-term trips of up to 90 days and 180 days, which is different to what the UK allows. For a limited number of business activities. This is a very narrow list under for the Schengen area for the UK's participation in the Schengen visa waiver allows for. It's things like business meetings, attending conferences, tourism, short study. Additionally, member states offer permitted activities like the UK does as part of their domestic immigration systems for short-term stays only. That these lists of permitted activities differ depending on which nation state you're going to as a UK national, and we recommend checking what's permitted in each country. If you plan to stay longer, again, like with the UK, you're likely going to need a visa, work permit or other documentation. And the key thing with this is just checking before you travel in case you need to apply. Next slide, please. So three key takeaways from this session today to all businesses are things that I've been probably saying throughout this entire speech, which is that, one, to check if you need a visa or other documentation if you're traveling for business purposes. If you do need to get some sort of documentation, make sure that you apply in as far advance as possible, which is what the UK allowing visa applications early hopefully will help. And finally, that all temporary workers who are moving to supply services or to work abroad, to make sure that their passports are valid for at least 6 months at the time of travel. Just handy things to keep in mind. Next slide, please. Ooh, next slide, sorry. Brilliant. Just before we wrap up, I really just wanted to touch on how a deal would change things slightly. So mode 4, temporary entry and stay, short-term temporary business travel, all the names that we've gone through during the session, is seen as very valuable to the overall success of a deal on services. And so we understand that it is really important to get comprehensive commitments on mode 4. Looking at published legal texts, which happened all the way back in February and March this year, it's clear to see that the UK and the EU are quite similar in the positions that we have with regards to mode 4, and that generally any agreement will be based on previous FTAs between the EU and Canada and Japan. So the language there might be similar. Obviously, subject to a deal being agreed along these lines, this would ensure that workers have guaranteed market access in a number of sectors of the economy, and create a minimum standard on how mode 4 suppliers should be treated. So, for example, eliminating nationality requirements and guaranteeing lengths of stay. Hopefully a deal will also diminish the administrative burden on business travellers. So in less instances would you need a work permit or need to meet an economic needs test. So that's kind of like a salary threshold. I think for me, one of the key things with regards to a deal is this last point kind of here about how it would ensure both sides have transparent visa application processes and clear signposting on the rules for business travellers to follow. Having spent a lot of time talking to businesses over the last few years about mode 4, about temporary entry and stay, we know how important this kind of user experience is when applying for documentation. So I think this is a really important one that hopefully, yeah, it's an important one to note. And then finally, a deal would hopefully provide a basis for a jumping off point for further liberalisation. So those are kind of the key things that I really wanted to mention today. I know there's a lot of questions in the chat, and hopefully I've kind of covered some of that in this presentation, but very happy to take some questions. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Katrina. You've definitely covered a lot of the questions throughout your presentation. Something I just wanted to note before putting questions to you is that there is a lot of information on gov.uk about for UK nationals travelling to the EU. I'll make note of this and make sure to circulate these in resources that we send out after the event. So first question for you, Katrina. I think, and this is something we actually hear quite a lot, to qualify for a visa waiver, so to not need a visa, does this allow for 6 months stay in every 12-month period, or just 6 months all in all one-off?
So first of all, just to kind of come back to your point about the information on gov.uk, that's definitely a great place to go looking for information, and I really recommend the country guides. So if you're travelling to a specific member state, there should be information there that I do really recommend. On your question regarding without needing a visa, it's not necessarily a visa waiver. That's a very different thing and isn't part of any UK-EU FTA agreement or domestic processes, but it is within the gift of the UK's domestic immigration system to allow for instances where third country nationals, specifically non-visa nationals, so those who are designated as not needing a visa, can travel into the UK. Now, on the question with regards to 6 months I think it is within a 12-month period. My colleagues at the Home Office may know better than me, but that's my understanding, that it is within a kind of a set period. And if you are travelling for longer than 6 months, again, you may need to get a visa. It's more than likely you will, and to make sure that you do that in as far in advance as you can.
Thank you. Another question we get a lot is whether, and again, the Home Office might be best placed to answer this. I'm not sure they're on the line anymore, but do visa requirements apply to UK nationals that live in the EU that travel to the UK?
This might be a better one for the Home Office. I think it's my understanding that that is fine. I mean, it depends. It might depend on what they're going to do, but generally they're a UK national, so I don't see a problem from my perspective, but I am not the expert on this, unfortunately.
No worries, that makes sense. We'll take that one away. There are a lot of questions about the differences between manufacturing, supplying goods in the UK, all of these things which are listed on the list of permitted activities. And I wondered, first of all, does the manufacturing and supplying of goods to the UK, which appears on this list, also apply for intra-company activities?
So there are separate activities in an intra-corporate space that I do really recommend everyone having a look at. So I think it's things like advising, consulting, troubleshooting, providing training, sharing skills and knowledge. I think the key thing with the kind of manufacture and supply of goods is that it's the wording specifically, so you have to be an employee of a foreign manufacturer, and you also have to have a contract of purchase or supply. But the specific implications of these permitted activities is something that really is in the gift of a border official, and is not something that I can specifically go through with the nitty-gritty. Unfortunately, it's not our area. It's owned by colleagues in the Home Office.
Thank you. And just generally, the exceptions that apply on the permitted list of activities for intercorporate transfers, is it just those activities, or is it those activities in addition to the rest of the activities mentioned?
So those ones are specifically permitted within the intercorporate space. So you, for example, you couldn't be a contractual service supplier, so somebody working for one company and going to work for another one and be able to use that in the same way. It's very clearly stated that you have to be an employee of an overseas based company to use those activities that way. There are obviously a lot of activities on this list, and again, I would really recommend everyone to look through and to make sure that your circumstances fit with them. The precise wording, as I've said, kind of comes down to an interpretation of a border official, and it is much more of a Home Office question than one for me, unfortunately. Okie
doke. And I just wondered if you could clarify the position of hauliers that would be travelling to the UK transporting goods. Will they need visas, and what sort of documentation would they need to carry across the border?
So unfortunately, I cannot really answer any questions on hauliers as they're owned by our colleagues in goods. It's very tricky. I know there's lots of people owning different areas, but it's not something that I unfortunately can go into too much detail on, I'm afraid.
Okay, no worries. I'll make note of that one as it's appeared quite a few times, and we'll definitely provide some information on that after the event. I will take a couple more questions. So if an EU national is the director of a UK limited company, are they allowed to stay longer than 6 months in the UK after 2020?
I mean, I'm not so sure if there's any specific limitations for board members off the top of my head. But, you know, if they are travelling for longer than 6 months, they would generally just need a visa, and it shouldn't be too much of a problem. It would really depend on the circumstances of what they were doing and how long they were staying for, to kind of specify exactly what they would need to do. But yeah, that would be my general sense of what would be possible.
That makes sense. Thank you. I am just seeing what other questions I can ask you as opposed to the Home Office. We still have quite a few questions in the chat about the use of ID cards. Now, I know this was mentioned, but is there any chance you can do a recap on the use of EU ID cards?
Yeah, absolutely. So just to clarify, so from the 1st of October 2021, EU, EEA and Swiss national ID cards will no longer be accepted by the UK as valid travel documents. However, some may be able to continue to use national ID cards to enter the UK until the 31st of December 2025 and for very limited circumstances. So the ones that are specified are having settled or pre-settled status under the EU settlement scheme, having a frontier worker permit, or a S2 healthcare visitor, or a Swiss service provider. I think, yeah.
Thank you. Thank you, that's very clear. And just to clarify as well, if one was to come over to the UK for under 6 months to undertake one of the permitted activities, is there anything they need to carry to prove that they'll be in the UK for under 6 months, or to prove the kind of activity they're going to undertake?
I mean, not really. To my understanding, I think a Home Office colleague would be better placed, because this comes down to the border process, which we don't really engage too much on. It's a slightly separate thing. But you know, if you do fit that bill of being able to move without needing a visa, I don't see any need to kind of prove it, but it may be also useful to just have, you know, your contract or an email, something saying it, and just in your back pocket. But that's more me, and I wouldn't really want to speak for a Home Office colleague who would be better informed and better able to help you on that one.
Okie dokie, no worries. Thank you very much. We have come to the end of your session, so thanks very, very much for joining us, Katrina, and thank you to everybody else that's helped out. Before everybody leaves, Matthew, if you could kindly jiggle the slides along, thank you. I just wanted to ask you if you could kindly please fill in the same poll you filled in earlier. It will be a follow-up to assess your awareness of these topics after the webinar. So it's following the same instructions as before. You can use the QR code on the screen, the link in the chat, or go to slide.do yourselves. If you wouldn't mind taking a minute just to fill in that question there, that would be brilliant. Thank you. And other than that, I hope this webinar proved useful for everybody. Thank you ever so much for joining us. We will be following up, as I said, with slides and further resources, and we will try our best to group up the questions that have been asked in the chat today and try to provide answers to the most pressing ones. And thank you to all the speakers. Have a lovely afternoon, everybody.